Hey, everybody. Welcome to Spread the Word Chapter 3 discussion. I'm Nolan Brown. We've got Father Jerry and Kinney on the call with us as well. And we're going to be walking through Chapter 3, which is Evangelism in the Early Church. Hopefully, you've read that chapter. We'll be walking through this, and then at the end, we'll have some discussion questions for your group there in your local parish as well. Father, would you mind opening us in prayer?
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O heavenly King, Comforter, the Spirit of truth, you are present everywhere and fill all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life. Come and dwell in us. Cleanse us from every stain and save our souls, O good one. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, we ended chapter 2 with this idea that the early church was mission minded and intentional. And that's something that carries over, of course, into the discussion of the early church. It's kind of funny these two chapters really go hand in hand because the New Testament is the early church lived out in a lot of ways. Um, so clearly the clergy are very much involved and leading the charge in a lot of the mission and the planting of new churches. You've got Paul, you've got Timothy. But it's also true that there is a participation by the laity in growing the church. And we see that. Um, I'm curious to think about how we have encountered, this false idea that really this clericalism, that it's all on the priest to do everything. And maybe Father Jerry, you can kind of explain how that's played out even in your own ministry and what you've encountered there.
I think Father Evan Armitage talks about this, about the daddy parish,
Hmm.
you know, for everything we run to daddy. Um, versus a parish where there's shared decision making, there's shared responsibility, there's co-ministry. And so, yeah, I think I think the fact that we in the past parishes were very much daddy parishes
Mm.
is because of the FOP principle,
Mm.
the fault of priest,
Mm.
or in Greek, papas. This idea that we wanted somebody to blame when things weren't going well. And if we made it all about the priest, then we'd have someone to blame
Mm.
versus taking responsibility ourselves.
Sure.
So yeah, so a lot of our parishes maybe still are in that paradigm of being a daddy parish.
Mm.
Um, and in those cases, everything falls in the lap of the priest.
Sure.
After all, he's the only one being paid. So,
Mm. Mm.
so um, the idea of co-ministering parish uh, has kind of been not really been
Mm.
talked about too much.
Yeah. Yeah. The movement away from the daddy model and more to the empowered leadership model is, I believe, what Father Evan references. Um, it's an interesting tension of fear of knowing, am I really qualified to do this? Am I not? Navigating the authority structures that are appropriate within the church. I mean, we spoke last time on the last episode a little bit about, an evangelist needs to be teachable. They have to have discernment. There's really a need to foster and cultivate a a tact, you could say, of how do you emulate the love of Christ, who's incarnational and not forceful with the message. Um, this is something. Interestingly, I'm taking quite a few classes right now, and several of them are on pastoral counseling or pastoral education and listening and the art of listening and how to help people through whatever it is they're going through, and that your presence is really the most important thing, but the words you say and the fact that you show up embodied is foundational to that. But it is interesting to navigate the tensions between how to be empowered in your giftings, um, to do these functions, and then what's just the basic responsibility of any person. I mean, we know there was always a missionary imperative in the Orthodox Church from the earliest days. That's a quote from page 61. And so the reality is, though, is that that was something that every person participated in some way. I mean, they were ministers in their community simply by loving their neighbor. And it's a requirement, one of the two greatest commandments, and I don't think you can do one without the other. I think they're two sides of the same coin. Um, but Kenny, how have you seen this idea of, well, that's not for me to do. I just come to church, or what have you seen maybe in your own parish as it's expanded your evangelism team and you've done things? What are maybe some positive stories of how people have really stepped into their gifts? What have you seen there?
Yeah, I do think that's probably it is really common to believe that the priest is to do everything. And but I do know that when the parish learns that that's not the case, the priest is very happy that the parish has learned that lesson. Uh, because like the book, it seems like one thing I liked about the book in the particular chapter was he did describe in long detail how the bishops were involved in missions and starting mission efforts. Like everything was done, according to hierarchy, which is how it should be. But it was also because of that, it was given structure, and it
Mhm.
seems like in that structure. Um, was allowance for laity to be laity and to spread the gospel, spread the word, but like so that the laity was able to um, kind of venture out in safety and creativity, but also doing that in a way that there was some fences around how that was supposed to be done. And we saw that even in his examples about the various bishops. He mentioned three or four starting different missions, and some of them were like, well, the bishop did this. Some of them were the bishop sent someone out. Sometimes he sent out priests or deacons. Sometimes the bishop was nearby. But they were all like answering the question, how do we start new missions?
Mhm.
Where's the next place for the gospel to go to? And how do we creatively provide a place for that to blossom?
Mhm.
And so that seemed to be like where the hierarchy is doing its best work in giving us these like creative outlets but also giving us um,
Mhm.
fences to work within.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
that's
think that's true of the parish in a very small sense, like you said, like examples of my parish. Um, like the priest gives us the fence of what we're able to do and encourage us to, to be creative in it, but maintain that fence.
Mhm.
And so it gives us a sense of safety and also an awareness of what we can and can't do.
Mhm. It's
And I think
freedom
it
of
works really well.
limitations in a lot of ways.
yeah, that structure is still as vital today.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. Something that is fascinating about the idea of this growth mindset or this mission imperative that the early church had is that they were clearly motivated to spread the word, which is the title of the book. And it seems that from the top to the bottom, there was a motivation to do that. But what the clergy were doing as they went into a new area is they were looking to foster new leadership to be from that area, ordaining people from among the laity into the clergy to expand and grow even the clergy side of that uh, dynamic. And I find that fascinating is that there's a desire to really foster the spiritual gifts. And like as we said in the last episode, I didn't even know evangelist. It never dawned on me that evangelist was a role that actually had a title. And as St. Paul talks about, I think it's Ephesians 4, he mentions some are called to apostles, some are called to be evangelists, some prophets, some teachers, some he's like all of these different roles um, that we don't really, at least I haven't consciously thought like, well, who's the apostle or the evangelist in our community, or who's the this, that, or the other kind of roles. It's we've almost had a flattening and a separation into just two groups. Now I've seen beautiful expressions of lay leaders giving a homily, or there being teachers rising up to be church school teachers or whatever. There are some expressions of that. Um, but I find it interesting that these roles were more diverse, it seemed, than we tend to practice now. Um, what have been some of the barriers maybe that come up? I mean, I know Kenny and some of the work that we've done on how to build an evangelism team. It's if you think you're going to wait till you're ready, you'll never do it kind of idea. But
Sure.
maybe you can touch on some of that for a little bit.
As far as a barrier.
Yeah, or just like stepping out of the comfort zone, and what does that look like to take that first step?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose that it is pretty common
Mm,
that when people come to our presentations or conferences or ask us questions, there is this like, well, I'm not ready.
mm,
Um, I don't know enough yet. I haven't learned enough yet, and so I'm not able um, to share my faith or share the gospel.
mm,
And I understand that feeling, that trepidation. But again, if we're trying to be like Christ, be like the disciples, be like those stories that are read in the Gospels, in the Scriptures, um, that's rarely the case, right?
mm,
I mean, almost every example. I mean, Saint Philotini being um, the most clearest example is of someone who didn't know anything, and
mm.
then Christ met her, and her life has changed, and then she immediately says, "Come meet this man."
Right.
Right. And there's no like theological doctrine going on or debates. He just was like,
Oh,
this person changed my life. You should, in the phrase of the scriptures, come and see.
mm,
Um, and so that's really, if we're to emulate what we see in the Gospels, that's what we're called to do.
mm,
Is not necessarily wait until we're ready, and
mm.
not to say that we shouldn't be learning more or gaining more knowledge and being
Sure.
coming closer to Christ. Of course, that's all true, but once we've had an encounter with Christ, we have our very first story, right? And
Mhm.
we have something that other people want to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. You bring up a really powerful point, and I think it ties into something Father Jerry said earlier as well, is sometimes the knowledge, the theological knowledge, is actually more dangerous to have because you're tempted to try to give answers that people aren't even looking for. You
You're not
mentioned
asking those questions. You're
exactly.
giving answers to questions nobody's asking.
Yeah. Yeah. And for whatever motive or reason or insecurity or you just like to hear yourself talk or whatever. I mean, I'm guilty of these things, for sure. But it's fascinating to me that we can feel unqualified when every single person is actually fully qualified to share the joy of the experience of Christ and his church that they have had. Every single person is qualified to do that. And it's almost like, well, I can't do that. I don't have an MDiv. I'm not ordained. I don't know. What if they ask me about the essence and the energies? Like, well, then you defer to the people who have that education. But that's actually a greater witness, in my opinion, to not know those things and to say, I have such a peace and a freedom that I don't have to understand everything. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. I don't have to. Um, there was something that struck me. This is years ago before I even found Orthodoxy, but I was convicted that this Christian faith has to be accessible to the simpleton. It cannot be something that is exclusive only for the intellectually elite, for the people who can understand these high ideas. And that struck me as, and I found it within Orthodoxy because you can participate with the faith of a child. You can show up, you can receive, you can serve, you can love, you can do all the things that are required to be on the way with Christ and not have any necessarily depth of theological understanding. Just like you can eat without understanding digestion. I've heard that parallel used before. You won't starve to death just because you don't understand how food breaks down in the digestive system. It will work. Um, and that's not to say that knowledge and theology and education isn't a good thing, but I think it can be a major pitfall, and it's freeing to know that you don't have to know all that stuff to actually share the love and the beauty that we have.
I did like that about this chapter in the section neighbor neighbor. Uh,
Mm,
he has a quote there where he says, "So much of the work of spreading the gospel, and perhaps the most effective work, was done by average, ordinary men and women
mm,
who witnessed Christ.
yes.
It's impossible to imagine the spread of Christianity without this effort."
Yeah.
Uh, and I do think there's a place for theological questions, and if we're able to answer them, we ought to. And there's some people that really is their barrier, right? That
Mm,
they have a theological issue and they need it to be resolved,
totally.
and so we should do our best to remove whatever barrier that is so they can meet Christ. But um, it just doesn't seem that that's the most common thing.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
but there are people that's exactly what they need. There are people who need Saint Justin the Martyr and that kind of thing, right?
Sure.
But then what the author's saying is that this was spread by ordinary men and women.
Mm.
Um, when we look at the disciples and who they were, ordinary men and women, um, just sharing what God told them.
Mhm.
And this is the way that Christianity spread, was fishermen, tax collectors talking about Jesus.
Right.
And that's the same thing that we're trying to do now. That's part of why we're recording these videos. That's why we're hoping to establish more evangelism teams, is that this kind of thing uh, is what we mentioned in a previous video about the idea of evangelism, the term evangelism becomes reclaimed and
Mhm.
is part of what it normally means to be an Orthodox Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. That's absolutely beautiful. So beautiful. The normalcy of it really needs to be established, that this isn't anything grand beyond simply sharing your own experience.
Yeah.
And from there, it's just walking with people in relationship together. And there's such a relief to that. Um, the neighbor to neighbor, the idea of meeting in homes and sharing their personal stories. I think that's something you've touched on in prior videos in different contexts, Kenny. But I see that as such a powerful witness to the love of the people of God opening up their home to allow people to belong in their community, even when they don't yet participate in anything else beyond it. It's the willingness to host. It's the willingness to consider a person who's outside of, we're such a lonely society. We're so connected technologically that we end up being less connected in reality. We feel more alone than we ever have. And I think one of the greatest needs people have is to belong, to be part of a people. And for us to simply open our homes and invite neighbors and friends over for dinner, and to simply invite them to be part of the community is huge. And that's something anyone can do, really.
And this idea that it doesn't matter who you are
Mm.
welcome into our fellowship
Yes.
was very indicative of those early years. And I was reading another book last night about holy fools and how, for the years of the persecution of the Christians, that witness was sufficient to be a form of evangelism, you
Mm.
know. But then when Christianity became, accepted and more organized, I guess you could
Mhm.
say, it was the advent of the holy fools who would go out and witness, evangelize to the marginalized of society,
Mm.
right? Who
Mm.
could relate to them because the holy fools were marginalized. They were
Sure.
considered out,
The
out
misfits. Right. Yeah.
misfits, right? In this idea. So,
Mm.
but I want to share one of my favorite memories is growing up as a kid. I grew up in a row house outside of Philadelphia, and so you're connected by a common wall with your neighbor.
Mm.
And so I remember getting up, having breakfast, going off to school. Um, my mom would come out, see us off, and then with a cup of coffee, and then our neighbor Loretta would come out with her cup of coffee, and they would just spend hours together, you know, neighbor to neighbor talking and sharing their life together, and
Mm.
that was one of the strongest relationships ever, right? This idea, and dad was off to work, kids were off to school, and they just love that time together. So
That's
yeah.
excellent. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Well, that idea of Christians would accept anyone is really, I think, powerful, because I think that we tend in our parishes to have, a lot of our communities don't know we exist in the first place, or they might think that we are, kind of sequestered off into our own world, and that we aren't really for them. Whatever labels we might put on ourselves, or whatever ways we might erect barriers that make people feel like, well, why would I want to go be part of that? That's not who I am, kind of
That's
idea.
that's that's the church for the Greeks.
Sure, sure, whatever thing it is, right? And maybe in some ways we actually carry that
Right.
Maybe not in our own conscious, we wouldn't say it, but the way we act and the way we behave,
Right.
it implies it. And it reminds me of high school when there's cliques. It's like, okay, well, I'm clearly not accepted at that lunchroom table because I don't have a letter jacket on because I'm not the football player or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's just these questions of, have we presented ourselves in the community in such a way that people by default think, well, that's not for me. That I don't belong there. And does that speak louder than words in a lot of cases? And so the idea that we aren't, not only are we not evangelizing proactively by being intentional and going out and telling to come and see, we're actually communicating subliminally maybe that don't come and see. This isn't for you. And so there's some interesting self-reflection that I think has to happen
Mhm.
in how, it's, I have visited parishes before where, and this is a very innocent mindset of just everyone assumes that everyone there has been there before. And I'd been Orthodox for almost a decade by this time, and I go in and the liturgy ends, and I have no idea where the fellowship hall is. And this particular parish was a bit of a maze to find it. And I wandered around in circles until I finally asked someone, like, where's the fellowship hall? And then it was interesting because the reaction of the person I asked was this, oh, someone who doesn't know where they are. Like it was just a baseline surprise that someone might not know where to go. And I thought, okay, there's some self-reflection we need to do about, we are evangelistic. We are an apostolic church. If they happen to stumble through our door, the welcome team and different aspects of just gaining this awareness, I think is huge. But then, Kenny, you've mentioned in some of the presentations before, like, what if someone with face tattoos walks into your parish? Or like, how will the community or even you personally react to someone who is so strikingly different? What would we do with that? And how are we reflecting on, would we show the love of Christ? Would we be afraid to interact with them? Thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think um the idea of like face tattoos and that kind of stuff is a kind of alarming example, but I think that if you could actually go to something much simpler,
Mm,
which I think happens often in parishes. Someone comes and they brought coffee.
mm,
Right.
yes.
So
My
so
wife tried to do that when I
yeah,
dragged her to her first Orthodox service, and she was so upset that she had to leave her Starbucks latte in the car to curdle while we did
yeah.
throws and liturgy, because of course I brought her to the entire experience. It was, but
Yeah,
that's just
but
what
there
they're
are so many
used to,
people visiting our
Yeah.
parishes that have a background of not only is coffee allowed, but it's supposed to be there,
Hmm.
and so but it can be very jarring, and so it is a small test to our
Yeah.
communities of how they respond. Um, some of those might respond well, some of them might give dirty looks.
Mm,
I remember a story that was similar to this where um, there was a parishioner that was so offended by this new person
mm,
um, that that new person left the church kind of angry and scandalized,
mm.
and then the priest said talked to that parishioner later on and says, this person you will pray for the rest of your life, like you will like
Yeah.
this, because you're not responsible for what happened to her, because
Mm,
your demeanor
mm.
uh, took her away from the church.
It's heavy. It's very heavy.
Remember,
It is. Oh, go ahead, Father.
remember receiving an email from a young woman who was inquiring, and she said, "Will I be, will I be able to come to attend a service at your church because I have blue hair?"
Mm,
And I wrote back, "Of course. Just having hair is great, you know.
sure, sure. Yeah.
Just think of those who have no hair."
Yeah, not everybody has that.
Well, and it's fascinating, those stories of people who have the courage to ask.
Yeah.
It's like, how many more people, for every one person who's willing to email and say, "Can I show up this way?" How many more just don't bother? Or maybe they do try and then it's fascinating to me how the fear of going and doing something new I grew up as a pastor's kid. I was always in my home turf when I was at church. Like I was very comfortable with church and all this. And the first time I went to an Orthodox church, I was petrified. And
Mhm.
it was like, if you've never been the new kid at school, I highly recommend going and just being the new person in a context. Just go visit some organization, go to the Rotary Club, go to something where you don't know what you're doing and you don't have any idea what's supposed to happen, and just feel that, and then think, this is probably how someone feels when they stumble through the doors of an Orthodox church for the first time. And then that'll give you a lot of grace for how they behave or what they're doing, but also to inspire the idea of accepting everyone means that we have to have a love of the outsider, the philoxenia, the love of the foreigner, and that we have to have grace and compassion, um, and show up for them. But yeah, it's beautiful.
And not only people that are different than us, but people that have been, in a sense, disregarded by society,
Yeah.
who today are living on the margins, right?
Yes. Absolutely.
So our philoxenia has to extend even beyond those who are might have a face tattoo or blue hair.
Hmm.
And our parishes need to be a welcoming place for those who are being disregarded by society, who
Hmm.
don't feel like they belong anywhere.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this is a beautiful quote from page 66 that I think just touches on this. And it's, those on the receiving end of evangelism encountered a love they had never known before, and this transformed everything. And I think that is just such a powerful statement of the witness of Christ is to say, he who is without sin, let him throw the first stone. Neither do I condemn you. Where are your accusers? It's to just show up and to love the person and to let everything else work itself out. We're not here to fix people. We're here to help, to be a healing presence and to be healed ourselves through that. But another quote is the early Christians were leading very converted lives on page 68. And I think that that is such a powerful question for us to really examine in our own life. And we'll get into the discussion questions later. But this idea of, is my faith and my relationship with Christ and my participation in church actually fostering a love for neighbor, a life that someone would look at and say, that is actually inspirational. That is actually filled with hope and with joy. Or is my participation in church more nominal and more routine and more, I just do this because, and it's kind of, do I think about how I can get out of it if I can, kind of, where are we on that spectrum, and how do we move more towards joy and hope? Um, it's fascinating to me.
I think he ends the chapter with the same sort of sentiment.
Yes.
He says, "Very few of us will have to face death because of our faith in Jesus Christ, but all of us have to face life.
Mm.
The way we do so should have the power to convert others."
Yes.
And I think that's true. Like that, we've all faced challenges in our life and discovered how the Orthodox faith has helped us overcome them.
Mm.
And so it's those real stories of the Orthodox faith being used in our lives that we can then say, well, ideally, you can share that with someone who's gone through the similar
Yeah.
thing to say,
Yeah.
you're going through this. I went through this. This is how the Orthodox faith helped me through that thing. Right. So
Mhm.
then those are the connections that are the really powerful ones where your stories align, and this is how you found healing and salvation.
Yes. Yes. Well, and that is the witness. That is the testimony. And really, that is the entire beauty of the church, is that the way that we then live our lives, because we have hope in the resurrection, because we know that all of our suffering and the difficulties are there to actually mature us and transform us into full human beings, that we can reflect that self-sacrificial love of Christ in our lives and be joyful. That is that's it. That's the gospel. That's the beauty. And that's inspiring. That is what has made Christianity spread throughout the centuries and around the world, and is very much part of the early church, that synergia, I believe, of this participation with God in our transformation and that dynamic. That's beautiful. Well, any last thoughts before we wrap chapter 3? Okay. All right. Well, we've prepared 5 questions for discussion. And again, feel free to pause after each question and discuss as a group. And here we go. So, question 1. How did the clergy and the laity work together in the early church to share the good news and evangelize? Question 2. Is our parish mission minded? Where is there an opportunity to improve our intentionality? Question 3. Does our parish host any public events for people to learn about our faith? If not, is this something we could explore? Question 4. In what ways has our parish welcomed people who might not feel like they belong? And question 5. Do the people around you see the difference that the faith in Christ has made? Awesome. Well, until next time, we will see you for chapter 4. Take care.